Chapter 1. Nick knew the incident hadn't hit the local news yet. The emergency dispatch center usually called him before a story went public. Judging by the sketchy details he had gotten over the radio, Callahan would have questions he needed time to answer. There had been fires before, but only a few caused by arson, especially in a quiet neighborhood like Hildusky. Just as Nick figured, neighbors had started to gather in front of the one-story bungalow on the corner. The van from Channel 11 screeched to a stop as the news team piled out and began to assemble, adding to the tension and chaos already mounting. It was times like this Nick hated being the sheriff. Pulling up, he watched as the bright red and orange embers climbed against the night sky, leaving behind broken charred beams of wood and thick billowy gray smoke. The fire chief called out orders to his men as they worked to put out the raging flames.
Sheriff Moran.
Nick heard his name called from different directions. He turned to Randy Denning and rushed over with the microphone in his hand, followed by his camera operator. With equally determined steps, Clyde Evans made his way across the yard, barely giving Nick the chance to collect his thoughts.
Just a minute,
Nick said, waving his hand, stopping Randy in his steps.
Mr. Evans, what happened here?
Nick asked, pulling the man aside to speak in private.
I heard some glass break in the house next door. Next thing I know, the house was up in smoke and flames. You see anybody suspicious hanging around? Just some teens. That was about a week ago. I don't know if they had anything to do with this. Firefighters are saying they found part of a printing press plate down in the basement. Printing press plate?
Nick frowned in confusion.
Yeah, like those metal plates for making counterfeit bills. Can you believe it? I didn't even know they were still using those. I guess I can believe just about anything these days. Thanks for your time.
Nick said, excusing himself from Clyde, taking in what he'd said.
Sheriff Moran.
Randy yelled.
Can we get a statement? It'll be a brief one.
Nick said, mentally preparing himself for what he was going to say in front of the camera. Randy cleared his throat and waited for his cue. Finally getting the go-ahead from his camera operator, he began.
Good afternoon. I'm reporting live from the corner of 7th and Hildusky. As you can see, this one-story house is practically engulfed in flames. We're told that the house has been abandoned for several months. Firefighters arrived at the scene shortly after a neighbor reported hearing glass shatter, followed by this grisly sight. Standing here with me now is Boyd County Sheriff Moran. Can you tell us what went on here tonight?
Randy asked, shoving the microphone in Nick's face.
At this time, the only thing I can tell you is what you can pretty much see for yourself.
Nick began.
Firefighters are working hard to get the fire under control. The cause of the fire is yet to be determined. However, once it's been completely exhausted, I will conduct a full investigation, as well as talk to the fire chief to gather as much information as possible. Were there any injuries?
He asked, shooting the microphone back to Nick.
Not as far as I know. Would you say this is an act of arson? That hasn't been determined. Do you have any suspects? It hasn't been determined if this fire was deliberate. So no, there's no suspects. That's all I have for now.
Nick rushed off as Randy turned back to the camera.
We will continue to bring you coverage as the details of this bizarre story unfolds. Randy Denning, Channel 11, reporting live from Midtown Callahan. Back to you, Frank. And that's a wrap.
The camera operator yelled. Nick stepped over to the fire chief, Martin Haley, who stood a few inches shorter, his portly frame stuffed neatly in his uniform.
Evening there, Nick.
Martin's husky tone rose over the thickness of his neck.
Evening, Martin. Any idea how the fire started?
Nick asked, getting straight to the point.
I'd be willing to bet it's arson, seeing how the kitchen reeks of turpentine. Clyde Evans said your men found a printing press plate in the basement. Is that true? Yeah, it's in pretty bad shape. I'm guessing somebody was using it to make counterfeit bills. Counterfeit bills in Callahan? That's the way it looks. Is that off the record? For now. I trust the plate is still inside. My men didn't touch it. How long do you think it'll take to wrap things up here? We're about done.
Martin said, scratching his head wearily.
I imagine you'll be out first thing in the morning? That's right. I'll stop by your office around 9 when I'm done. Sounds good, Nick. Good night, Martin.
The words trailed over Nick's shoulder as he left. Since the place was still smoky and needed to cool down a bit, Nick decided to call it a night. After a good night's sleep, he would be more alert and ready to conduct an investigation of the scene. Having finally made it home, Nick pulled into the driveway. From where he sat, all the lights in the house seemed to be off, with the exception of the porch light, which meant Chase and Allie were asleep. That was good, he told himself, not being up for a lot of questions regarding the incident tonight. Nick opened the front door and went inside. It was almost 12:30. Martin was expecting to meet with him at 9. That didn't leave much time for sleeping, especially when he usually spent half the night tossing and turning, ruminating over being a sheriff and a divorced father of 2. If that wasn't enough, now there was a possibility of someone making counterfeit bills and what that meant for Callahan. Nick made his way down the hall. He poked his head into Chase's room. The soft moonlight from the separation of the drapes brightened the room. There lay Chase, stretched out to the full length of his bed, sound asleep. Nick went to Allie's room. She, too, was sleeping soundly. Seeing Elizabeth on the floor, he crept over, picked up the doll, and tucked it snugly back into bed with Allie. What a fool Susan was to leave the children, and him, he thought, closing the door. Nick went to his bedroom. He stripped down, leaving a trail of clothes on his way to the bathroom. A hot shower, among other things, was what he needed. Having gone through his usual ritual of soaping down, rinsing off, and drying, Nick put on his pajama bottoms and a t-shirt, and then climbed into bed. There he lay, staring at the clock on the nightstand, wishing he could go to sleep.